The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is one of your co-hosts, David Hendrickson. Dan, say hello.
How's it going?
Hey, so as everybody knows by now, this podcast is really designed to highlight Good Samaritans and maybe not the current modern day definition of a Good Samaritan, but really the definition of the Good Samaritan according to Luke chapter 10, which really identified somebody who was culturally, politically, ethnically, religiously, societally really separated from somebody that he saved. And when Dan and I talked about doing this podcast, geez, Dan, it's been a couple months now.
Yeah.
Chris Palusky is a name that came to mind to me right away. And so, Chris, I want to welcome you to our podcast and officially introduce you to our audience. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Well, Chris, we obviously want to talk about everything. This is probably a stressful time for you during COVID-19, to be candid. So we really appreciate you joining us. But I'd like to dial back the clock a few years, if you don't mind, because you and I met when you were with a different organization, World Vision. We can say that, right? World Vision. And you told some pretty incredible stories of the way you and your family lean into humanitarian crises around the world. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a highlight of how your family's doing and maybe some of those incredible stories of you all being Good Samaritans?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about our journey just together. It's been a good one. We've been married for 21 years. And actually, I started in humanitarian work resettling refugees in Atlanta. Couldn't make a living doing that, so I ended up being a driller for a year, and I met my wife during that year. And she was a daughter of a missionary. We were both 28 years old. We dated for 3 months. We were engaged for 4, and we've been married for 21.
Awesome.
So it was a quick journey. But
Chris, are you from Atlanta?
I was born in Minnesota, raised in Atlanta, Georgia.
Outstanding. Wow.
Yep. So Atlanta's still home.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Respects. And then it's interesting, though, about 6 months into our marriage, I got a call from a group I was working with, and they said, hey, there's a war in Kosovo, and we're seeing refugees. We know that you worked with refugees with us before resettling. Would you be interested in going to Albania to help out? And I said, I want to pray about this and talk about it with my wife. And I prayed about it, and it was kind of funny. I talked with my wife, Tammy, and said, hey, do you want to go to Albania and work with Kosovo refugees? And she said, yeah, sure. That sounds great. Where's Albania? So she's kind of had an open heart as a missionary kid, born and raised in Peru. So she's kind of used to it. But from there, the journey took off. So we started to do disaster response work. We were in Kosovo for a year. Then we moved to Mozambique. We were in Malawi, Afghanistan, throughout Asia, Central Asia. I'm trying to think of all the places we've been. Latin America. And we've had great opportunities to meet people who have just been remarkable. So, we've worked in places like Kosovo, where you had church pastors stepping up to serve really vulnerable populations that had been through war. We've had opportunities to be in places like South Sudan, where the church just stepped up, especially during this last civil war that they're still kind of in.
Right.
Serving the vulnerable populations. And then most recently, just seeing the church step up to places like Ethiopia, working with vulnerable populations, be it refugees from South Sudan or even the street kids that are there, helping them to find forever homes. It's been an amazing journey. So I went from one group to another, and I've been now with Bethany for, about 2.5 years.
Jeez, time flies.
It does fly.
So you, when we were sitting across the table from one another in Federal Way, you sort of told the story like this. Hey, there was a earthquake in X, and so my family packed up and went. Or there was a tsunami in Y, and so we packed up and went. Can you provide a little color on that? And how do those family conversations go? Because they're not just move related. Like you guys go after the hard stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'll give the example maybe of my daughter. And I'll use that because my daughter was born in Washington, D.C. I was working with World Vision at the time, heading up the disaster response. Actually, I was a program officer in the disaster response unit for World Vision and working with the U.S. government, trying to get funding for disasters. Well, the tsunami hit after my daughter was a year and a half old. And World Vision asked, would you be willing to go out to the field because of the capacity that we need we needed people out there now. And so I went home, and my wife and I sat in the backyard, and we prayed and we talked for a good half an hour, and we felt like, okay, this is the direction we're going to go. So called World Vision back and said, okay, where do you need us, and what does that look like? And they gave us some options. So 2 weeks later, we packed up and we moved to Sri Lanka, where we lived for a year. And from there, I got dengue fever during that year, so it was pretty sick.
Oh gosh!
Oh wow!
We ended up moving. Yeah, it was tough, but we did some really great work. Again, partnering with the church, doing everything from food programs to rebuilding houses to helping to rebuild markets to basically getting basic emergency supplies to people. And we did that as a family. So we lived in southern Sri Lanka for a year. At the end of that year, we moved back to the States and continued to do disaster response for a couple of years remotely. But then my son was born during that time. And when he was, I want to say, a year old, we felt like God was calling us back to the field. And there was an opportunity to move out to Myanmar, Burma. And so we packed up our family because there had been a huge storm out there, and it had killed hundreds of thousands of people. Mm. And there was this need, and we had this ability to serve. So we moved out there and did everything from emergency water supply to basic shelter items such as tarps to kind of you name it. We did that for a year. And then at the end of that year, the program was coming to a close, and I got a couple calls, and people asked me,
"Somebody get the dog."
Somebody. Sorry, I'm laughing at the dog. We moved to Lebanon. World Vision, and so we were out there for 2 years, and it was more development work. But during that time, I was there again with my family, and that's when the war started in Syria. And so we went, I went with the staff members up to the north of the country because we were asked by the United Nations to help out as they started to see a trickle of refugees. And at that stage, we had no idea how large it was going to be, and it just ended up being a flood. So that program grew and grew and grew. We stayed there for a total of 2 years. And I got that program going. And then I was asked to do remote disaster response. So being that guy that they kind of threw at a disaster when it arose. So my family, we packed up. We moved to Costa Rica where they had us based. And I would leave for several months at a time. To help start up disaster response in places like Mali and Niger and Senegal. Did some disaster response in Haiti. And then World Vision asked us to move back to Washington, D.C., where my daughter was born. So we moved back to D.C., and I headed up the disaster response unit at that point. So I got to move back, and it's interesting. We did full circle with my daughter, and and then World Vision asked us to move out to Federal Way to take on a different role, and that was several years later. And we again, this was a thoughtful, kind of prayerful time, and I headed up private funding and emergency affairs for World Vision, and I did that for about 3.5 years. And it was just a really wonderful experience to get people involved with the response work. And at that same time, there'd been kind of a tugging, like, okay, God, you seem to have me on this cycle. And I was approached by a group called Bethany Christian Services. And I said, tell me more about them. I wasn't that aware of them. And, we do domestic work, international work, faith-based, child-focused. I was like, wow, that sounds like a great group.
Right.
And that's why we ended up. We drove out from Tacoma, Washington, like 2.5 years ago, literally in my Pathfinder with my 2 kids, my dog, and my wife. And it's been an adventure. And that's just the 6th of it. That's my daughter's 16.
Wow.
So that's 16 years right there.
Yeah.
Hey, so when so spending all these times in these different places, do any of the languages stick to you? Do you pick up on any of the languages?
I'd love to say I'm really good at languages. I'm not. I'm okay in Swahili.
Okay.
I'm okay in German. For some reason, I studied that when I was in college and in high school, and maybe I wasn't thinking.
Minneapolis. That's your Minneapolis roots.
There you go. And Italian, believe it or not. So I studied Italian. I actually had moved to Italy. And I moved to the town of Siena, Italy. I thought it was the most beautiful town ever. In fact, I named my daughter Siena.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then Spanish too. So I've studied Spanish. I'm not excellent in it, but I can definitely get by with it.
So cool.
Yeah.
So, Dan, you're still a single guy, so maybe you can offer some perspective on this. I mean, if you got a phone call tomorrow and said, the worst of COVID-19 is in Spain, do you think you'd react like the Paluskys have all these years?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, if I felt truly called, I felt like I could make the difference. Yeah, maybe. I'll say maybe. I'll still just say maybe. Like if I really thought that I could change it, then yeah.
Wow.
And what's interesting, just to kind of note on this, and I felt like God had called us to go and serve, and He's given us these skills to do this work. But more than anything, what's been amazing to see is just people of faith, followers of Christ, step up in these different situations. So I feel like I've had the luxury of just seeing the church, the Big C, step up in these times of crisis and truly be the hands and feet of Christ to some of the most vulnerable populations here in the U.S. and across the globe. So, like we say, Good Samaritan, I just think I'm a guy, and I really am. But what's amazing, the things that I have seen, is just how Christians have really wanted and then they have served. Yeah. And even in a time like this, like we're in the middle of this virus, and we don't know how extensive it's going to be. Everybody's doing modeling, but I'm encouraged to see the church wanting to step up. And there are ways that the church can step up. They can get involved in things like foster care. They can get involved in, the international crises by supporting a church or an organization that does international relief and development work. Yeah. There's so many things that they can do. And I'm trying to urge people to say, we shouldn't be fearful now. This is the time that God is calling us to act. So I'm saying the statement, do something. Just do something. Be those hands and feet of Christ, because this is what we want to be seen for. This is what the world should know Christians for, of those people that do stuff. They're the doers. They're the hands and feet. They're not scared of these things. They're the ones who are like out in the forefront saying, hey, we want to serve.
Right. And Chris, I want to first of all, I love, you can hear the excitement in your voice for people of faith rising up and doing the work, getting involved in issues like this. How would you speak to our listeners and maybe the public at large when it comes to the topic of faith when a disaster happens? a tsunami strikes Sri Lanka and leaves 35,000 people homeless. An earthquake hits somewhere and tens of thousands of people are injured or killed. COVID-19, which is going to leave thousands of people in its wake. And yet the people of faith, the church, is in the response. So, Chris, how would you sort of reconcile these two extremes? You have tragedy, and then you have people of faith who engage and get involved. And, society would say, well, where is God in this tragedy?
So we do live in a broken world. And I think that's just a reality. And you know what? It's a broken world. There are going to be tragedies. There are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be disasters. And they're the biggest messes that we're seeing. So let's look at this. First, you've got, let's say, vulnerable kids in the U.S. You've got foster care system. Why are kids in foster care? Broken homes. You've got 440,000 kids in that foster care system. Internationally, you got the biggest refugee crisis that you've ever seen. I mean, we've got 71 million people displaced. 28 million of those are refugees, people who have been pushed up borders of the country. And then you've got the crisis with Central America. You've got people who are fleeing from gangs, trying to escape with their families. And so you've got all these messes, as I describe them. And I used to say, God is calling us his people, to be in the middle of the mess, to be his hands and feet. And then somebody said one day, where do you think Christ is? And I said, you're right. Christ is in the middle of the mess, and that's where he wants his followers to be. He wants to be with them. He wants to be with those people. He wants to shine and show people love, and that's what we need to do in the middle of the mess. So how do we reconcile it? I would say, rather than running from the mess, Christians should be running to be in the middle of the mess, figuring out how to serve the most vulnerable in the most difficult situations.
Yeah. Well, I love your response, and I still do put this in the context of the Good Samaritan, and I appreciate your humility. But, that parable was somebody going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, seeing somebody on the side of the road, and sort of the way Jesus told the parable is there were a couple people of faith that didn't quite do it right. They didn't lean into the mess. They didn't get involved. And yet a Good Samaritan, that at the time, Jewish people would have called them the other. They would have called them the outcast, is the hero of the story. And so I think it's a combination of love your neighbor with no qualifiers, and sometimes we let the wrong things kind of separate us from the broken. And the people who need our help. So I just love the way you and your family continue to lean into the mess. There's a couple of topics that will be fun to sort of talk about. I think the topic of refugees would be one, and then the topic of foster care would be another. And then you can certainly add whatever you would like to the list. You started out settling refugees in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. Dan lives in Atlanta. I'm not entirely sure I knew that was a thing. How did you get involved from very early on in this serving of refugees, and what does it mean for a city to be in the process of helping refugees get settled? It's ironic. So I, like many people, graduated from college. I had a degree in international affairs, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And what do you do when you don't know what you're going to do? You go back to school. So I went immediately back into grad school in public administration, something that I really did not care so much about, but I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I started a master's program in public administration at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, and I was doing research. I was doing research on different social systems, social care in the city, and I found out about refugees. Well, I'd always been interested in refugees. In fact, I had gone over and did a directed study as my final project at Kennesaw in Kosovo, in the Balkans, looking at refugees and displacement populations. And
I was doing research, and I found out about World Relief, that they were based in one of their headquarters was in Atlanta. And I called them up and I said, hey, I'd love to learn more about refugee settlement. How does it work? And they said, well, why don't you come on down? And I went down there and talked to some people, and they said, why don't you volunteer? I said, that's a great idea. I'd love to volunteer. And then about 3 weeks into it, they said, hey, how would you like a job? And I said, oh, that would be great.
That was a quick volunteer. That was a quick volunteer period.
Well, it was a kind of, and I'll say one thing, for a job, they said, and we can pay you $8,000 a year. I said, okay, great. This is wonderful. You know, I'm getting paid to do something that I'm really enjoying. So I continued to go to grad school, and I was also resettling refugees.
Wow.
And I found out in Clarkston, Georgia, there's a big refugee population. And what's unique
that's right.
about the World Relief model is we always tried to partner with the church. So it was like if you had a refugee family coming in, there was a church waiting there with you. Like, so you would receive them, they would help them in the first 90 days and hopefully even longer, just to be resettled, so that they were truly being the hands and feet of Christ to this vulnerable population. And that's much like Bethany now. That's how we work here. So, I mean, 21 years later, part of our work is resettling refugees and working with unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied refugee minors. And we partner with the church whenever possible. So, yeah, that's kind of how it started. And from there, it's interesting. I call it surfing. It was like from one thing to the next to the next. And God has just blessed myself and my family, and we've been able to have these opportunities.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, what goes wrong to create a refugee?
I think, gosh, that's a great question. What goes wrong? People. People go wrong. I think, think of all the mass displacements. Think about the wars. Why are people refugees? They're fleeing for their lives for one reason or another. So it's fear of persecution because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, because of their group, because their country's in the war. So if you look at Syria, great example. Yeah. You had people groups, and they started to fight. So this was, you had a ruling class. People didn't like that. They got in a war, and it became like a regional war. It was a proxy war between different governments that didn't like each other. And, I mean, it's people wanting power. I mean, you see it in Africa. You see it with a lot of the dictators that we've had to come across and go back years ago. I mean, Idi Amin. I mean, he was brutal. And it's happened in places like Mozambique. Mozambique was independent for how long? And they went into a civil war. South Sudan, great example. Yeah. You have a vice president and a president who were from tribes that didn't like each other. And because of their tribes not liking each other, they went to war with each other. And the whole country exploded. And this was like a year into their independence from there are people in greed, I think, are the main reason that the most vulnerable are affected, and that's why you have refugees. It's because refugees, the lion's share of them are women, children, and the elderly. They are the most vulnerable, and I want to say it's around 80%, 70 to 80% of those are the refugees. So when we're talking about the 28 million refugees, the lion's share of them are women, children, and the elderly.
Wow.
In fact, half of those are children. I can say that. Yeah, half of those are children.
Jeez.
Wow.
So it'd be interesting to maybe talk a little bit about some of the migration that occurs from Central and South America into the U.S. and sort of what you see there from a refugee standpoint. But I want to ask about Syria one more time, because I think we can sort of establish a declaration and from Chris Palusky and your experience that people of faith should get involved. People of faith should be a part of the solution. People of faith should lean into the mess and get their hands dirty and be the hands and feet of Christ, as you have described. So let's make that a declaration. One of the other places where I feel like people of faith, maybe it's just me, might get confused or conflicted when you think of Syria, and you also had sort of well, there's probably too much. We don't have enough time to talk about everything that happened there. But when people fled Syria, I remember hearing the stories of them taking their keys with them. A lot of middle class people, they had homes, they had families, and they were forced to flee, and they took their keys. And what that said to people was they want to go home. At some point, they want to go home. So how would you speak to people, period, but people of faith are largely the listeners to this podcast, about how you sort of think about the importance of protecting and resettling versus helping them go home? Like how do we, those are almost two opposing solutions. And maybe they're not, because you know a lot more about this than Dan and I do.
Well, maybe a good way to think about it is, for people that can't go home, we really want to help them to go home. There are some people that can't go home. So, for instance, if government was to take over, or let's just say, a certain government's taking over and they don't like Christians, then they would try to get rid of all the Christians in the country, and they could not go back to their country because they were being discriminated against because they were Christians. If they were, a good example now is the Rohingya from Burma.
Yeah,
they were pushed into the neighboring country. The Rohingya are Muslim, and they were pushed out by the Buddhist government. They can't go back to their country. They are not. They can't go back to their country because of their religion. So, but in other places, people can go back. A good example is before the war broke out in South Sudan. You had people that were returning because people in general, they want to go home. When I talked to the Syrian refugees, I was in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. I was also in the refugee camps in northern Jordan. People, they said, we don't want to be here. We want to go home. We want to go home.
Yeah.
And I think many, not all, will be able to go home at some point. They're waiting for the war to end. But there are some people that can't go back because maybe they were anti-Assad, which is the person who rules the majority of the country. If they were seen as fighting Assad, he would do horrible things to them and their family, so they cannot go home. So people who can go home, absolutely. We should help them in every way, shape, or form to be resettled back home. But there is this segment. There are these, was it 28 million refugees, and I want to say several million of those can never, ever go home. And most of them just sit in refugee camps. The average stay for a refugee in a camp is for 12 years. That's just the average stay.
Oh, my gosh.
Wow.
There are people who have been generations after generations in camps because they can't get status in the countries that they're in. So many countries would say, you can live in that camp, but you can't work here. You can't go to our schools. You can't. So people, they've got nothing. They've got nothing. They've got no hope. So I think refugee resettlement, it's important on so many levels. I think, ethical, it's the right thing to do. For business, it's great. I've got 500 businesses here in the state of Michigan alone that are saying, Chris, can we get more refugees? Because we really like to have them work with us. That we feel they're great employees, they're loyal, they want to make a better life for their kids.
Yeah.
And also people who are concerned about, those refugees. We just don't know about them. I always encourage people to get to know them, get to know one refugee. And I think that'll change your mind on who they are. They're people like you and I who have just been through hell and back, and they're really wanting to have a better life for their kids.
That's good.
That's powerful.
That's good. So, Dan, you're from Colombia.
Correct.
So, Chris, what is the refugee situation like at the southern border of the U.S.?
Well, if I dive deeper for a second. So We actually work in Colombia too, with Bethany, and we're working with Venezuelan refugees who are fleeing from Venezuela, helping keep families together. So we're, giving them survival kits. We're helping them set up with transport. We're getting them places where they can travel to. Usually they're going to Peru, someplace in Colombia around. But I mean, that's a huge refugee crisis. And so Colombia has been a great actor in this and helping to.
My aunt actually took in 3 refugees herself too. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, Colombia's just been a great example of how to be a good neighbor during this crisis. We have just been encouraged working with the government down there, and they've come to us and said, how can we help keep families together? So that's how we started there. Now, on our borders on the south of the U.S., I think people get confused of who's there and why are people coming. And I said flippantly one time, people don't want to come here to go to Disney World. They're fleeing for their lives. And it was a bit flippant, but I really meant it that, the people that we see coming are, kids who are our youth. We see women with their children coming to the border. We see the most vulnerable fleeing because in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the gangs rule. And I was in Honduras about, 3 years ago now. And I remember speaking with one gentleman, and he said, I'm thinking about making the trip to the U.S. And I said, well, why? Why is that? He said, well, I had to pay extortion money to the gangs. I don't have any more money. And my daughter is teenager, and they're going to take her, and they're going to, quote, pimp her out for that payment. And I can't bear that. And then I met with people here, and I asked them, why did you come? And there was one gentleman. He was a kid at the time. He's been here for 3 years. He said he and his brother were outside of church. The gangs came into the church, shot it up. And he got shot twice in the leg, and at that stage, he decided he couldn't stay there any longer. Another scenario was a story I heard from one of our caseworkers was there was this boy, and he was, I want to say, 14 years old. The gangs came into his house and told his father, he's now one of ours. He's reached that age. His father said, no, you can't have him. They executed the father in front of the kid. The kid literally ran out the back door of his house. He didn't look back, and he made the journey to the United States. So he came literally with the clothes. So people aren't fleeing to come to Disney World. They're fleeing because they're fleeing. It's so much insecurity. And so we are responding, and the church should respond, especially to kids. I mean, to myself, it's almost like a no-brainer. So I understand the politics around it. It's so politically dividing. We want to make it as simple as possible and say, take the politics out of it. We do foster care with kids, and they stay with us an average of 45 days because we are able to find sometimes a parent, a family member, or a family sponsor that's been approved by the family that goes through a background check, and that child then is placed with that family during that period of time. So they stay with us for 45 days with foster families that we recruit from the church. So we try to take the politics out of it and say, look, no matter what you think of why or how people are fleeing, they're fleeing a desperate situation, and let's boil it down. These kids are just kids. I mean, the average age of kids that we have in care, I want to say, is 13. So these are kids. And what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to, Jesus spoke real clearly about the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. I mean, these are the most vulnerable. And I always say we're a Matthew 25:40 organization, which talks about, Jesus separating the sheep and the goats, and the sheep were the chosen. And they said, why us? And he said, well, you took care of the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the prisoner. You did it unto me. So that's what we want to be. We want to boil it down, take the politics out of it, and say, we're taking care of vulnerable kids. No matter what you feel about the political crisis and how it's being politicized on both sides of the aisle, think about the kids. Think about the kids.
So can I talk about the Evangelical immigration table for a second, Chris? Sure. So this is, I think, something you and I have both put our names to.
Yep.
Make sure I have that correct. I think my name is there. I think your name is there. I think Rich Stern's name is there. I think Santiago Mellato's name is there from Compassion. He dedicated my son Drew, who's now 19 years old. But I really want to let our listeners know that I actually feel like politics has failed us a bit in this particular issue, because we've sort of forgotten how to think outside of the boundary of one party or the other. And I was so encouraged to see the evangelical immigration table sort of lean into the mess here, as you say, because I think I may have tweeted this or put it on my Facebook page, but I found that the political solutions were insufficient for this particular issue. And I just want to read the principles from the evangelical immigration table, and then talk more about what Bethany is up to with kids in this particular area. But sometimes you see the word evangelical and you're like, oh man, here we go. We're in trouble. We're in trouble. It's gonna be cast or communicated as something extreme. And here's what the evangelical immigration table says. And you can go to evangelicalimmigration.table.com and read. They write, our national immigration laws have created a moral, economic, and political crisis in America. As evangelical Christian leaders, we call for a bipartisan solution on immigration that does the following: respects the God-given dignity of every person, protects the unity of the immediate family, respects the rule of law, guarantees secure national borders, ensures fairness to taxpayers, establishes a path toward legal status and or citizenship for those who qualify and wish to become permanent residents.
Amen.
Right? You would never get this out of our political system. And I think for that reason, the evangelical immigration table, I think, has yet to sort of support or sponsor a piece of legislation, because they said nothing has sort of done these six things together. Why do you think we can't come to good solutions here, Chris? Because it seems to me that protecting kids would be something we can all rally around. Preventing drug and sex trafficking would be something we could all rally around. Keeping families together would be something we could all rally around. What's our failure here as maybe Americans or at least as Christians?
I think Americans have politicized refugees and immigrants on both sides of the aisle, and it's a pity. That's something that we used to both all agree with. It didn't matter if you were Democrat, Republican, or Independent.
That's right. Yeah.
People were like, oh, yeah, refugees. That makes total sense. That's part of our fabric. I'm actually from refugee stock myself. My great-grandfather fled from wars in Europe at the turn of the century. So I'm a refugee myself. And we used to be able to agree about it. And then I started to think about this, and we are looking to politicians maybe a little bit too much. And they'll say, it doesn't matter who you are.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And we're putting them on the pedestal where we should be looking to God for solutions. And so I would say politics is not the solution. I mean, we should pray for politicians, and we should push and we should advocate. Politics is not the solution. It's not God's plan A. God's plan A is the church, his followers, in meeting the needs of the most vulnerable around the world. There is no plan B. We need to push our legislators and depoliticize immigrants and refugees, but at the same time realize we need to open our hearts and our doors to the most vulnerable, be it, again, immigrants, refugees, foster kids, you name it. I mean, we need to be willing to take that risk to get in the middle of the mess.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Chris, talk. Can we go to COVID-19 maybe, and can you tell us sort of what challenges Bethany is seeing with this global pandemic?
People are scared out of their minds. It's a scary time. We've never seen anything like this in our lifetime, and people don't know what to think. The markets are going up and down. My message is, Christians, it's time to step up. It's time to do something. So Is it if you want hearts for something overseas? Is it partnering with an organization or a church who's helping people who are affected by this disease or will be? Because I see the refugee camps is the next fire ground for this virus. If it spreads to a place like, I don't know, some of the refugees I saw in northern Uganda, it's going to spread like wildfire because people don't have access to, washing their hands all the time. They don't have access to sanitation or even social distancing. They don't have the luxury, I'll say luxury that we do.
Yeah.
So I think I would encourage people of faith to look at the World Reliefs, the World Visions, the Bethany's, the Food for the Hungries, and support that. Here in the U.S., what we're seeing is, people are concerned and they don't know how to respond. And I'm saying now is the time to get involved. So is it with your church ministry and for a food pantry? Is it getting involved with foster care? Man, we need help with foster care because people don't know what to think. And what we're seeing on the backside of this, so let's say life gets back to normal in 2, 3, 6, 9 months. We don't know. Whenever it gets back to normal, and kids are back in school, that's when teachers start to find out how life was for kids at home. And I hate to say it, this is a stressor on families. So people turn to drugs, alcohol. I mean, abuse happens in the home. And on the backside of this, we feel there's going to be a flood of kids coming into the foster care system. Parents that are currently fostering, they're just going to be burnt out. I mean, like many of them. So I would say, find out about foster care. I mean, this is the perfect time to do it. There's going to be a need. And if you want to find a tangible way to get involved in your local community, that's a great way to do it with a really vulnerable population.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing that there are these stressors on our society, but this is the time of people of faith. They need to I don't know, get involved, do something, be it internationally, domestically. Again, it could be through a nonprofit, it could be through their church. And at the top of the list, I think there's something that we don't actually think about all the time. We need to pray for the people who are affected by this. We need to pray for a cure. We need to pray for the leaders. We just need to pray more about this whole thing. I think it's like this that when we need to really put our faith and trust in God.
That's good. So I want to, as we start to wind down here, I want to give you the opportunity to give us sort of the best Bethany Christian Services commercial that you can, and talk about everything that you guys are doing and how people can help you all specifically. I want to ask you about foster care, though, a little bit deeper. This is an issue that I think gets brought to the church from time to time. You may know that Dan and I, at Giving Company, the chairman of our board is Rick Jackson, who was a foster child and supports Faith Bridge here in the state of Georgia. It's an issue that's sort of really near and dear to his heart. I think we hear the statistic that if every church placed like 3 kids or 2 kids or something like that. One. Is it 1? Yeah.
Wow.
Tell us about this issue and why Christians should be more involved here.
So we live in a broken world, and who are the vulnerable in it? It's kids. So if churches would step up, and let's say church just took in 1 kid, and that could be a family to take in that one child into foster care. That doesn't mean that one family should do it by themselves. Churches can do it as communities. I mean, they need to support each other to do that. That could help to end the foster care crisis that we have in this country. Right now, there are well over 400,000 kids in the foster care system. And I think it's 100 and something. No, I forget how many age out each year. But right now, out of that 400 some odd number, there's over 120 some thousand that are in need of a forever home, meaning their parental rights have been cut. Their parents are shown that they cannot handle a child. So those children need a forever home. If a church would step up and adopt those children, I mean, this is our opportunity, church. This this is our chance to truly be the hands and feet of Christ with kids. And I think that's what it's just important that people understand. We're talking about kids.
Right.
And kids need a loving home. They shouldn't be stuck in institutions. They shouldn't be bounced around. Kids need stability, and they need somebody who's going to love them. And who should be that love? I mean, the church. It should be people of faith. It should be Christians. That was Christ's command.
Yeah. So, Chris, as people are listening to you talk right now, if they are interested in fostering, getting involved in foster care, what's the next step?
There's lots of great organizations out there. I mean, Bethany, we're in 35 states. I would encourage people, if they're interested in working with Bethany, go to bethany.org. And it'll pull up a little thing and show you where your branch is. You can call them, or there's a website for each of the branches too. And also, you can just look up foster care on your computer, and there'll be a list of organizations that deal with foster care. I always encourage people of faith to partner with foster care organizations that have similar faith background there too, because I think it's a great opportunity for the church to be the church working with Christian organizations. So I would encourage people to check out what's in their area and what's the best fit for them. But if everybody would just step up, it could be a game changer. It just could change. It could change hundreds of thousands of children's lives.
And so there are Catholic foster care organizations, there are Baptist foster care organizations. So that's sort of what you were saying. People could kind of find where they think they slot the best.
Yep, absolutely.
Wow, that's awesome.
So Bethany is an ecumenical one. So we work a lot with Presbyterians. We work a lot with Baptists, the Christian Reformed Church. I mean, we work in that segment. But there are specific ones, like, some people would say, I only want to work with a Catholic one. Great. Yeah. That's wonderful.
No problem. Yeah.
That's great. Somebody says, I don't want to work with a faith-based organization. Okay. That's fine too. That's fine too.
Man. So Chris, as we sort of wind down here, I want to give you the opportunity to just sort of talk about everything that Bethany is involved with. And you mentioned Bethany.org, but let's first talk about that. Give me the scope of Bethany Christian Services. What's everything that you guys touch right now?
So Bethany, we've been around for 75 years. We were started by two gritty women. They really were tough as nails here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it started with one child, taking care of the child. It expanded to foster care, adoption, and the work spread like wildfire to the past 75 years. So now we are in 35 states. We are in 8 countries, and we're about 1,700 staff across all those services. We work with vulnerable kids in the U.S., so we do family preservation. Whenever possible, we try to keep families together. But we've seen that's not always possible. So there's hence the need for the foster care system. So we recruit wherever, whenever, however, through the church to get those foster homes. So we do foster care, and with the goal to be reunited with their family. But we've seen that's not always possible. So then we do foster care adoption. And again, we partner with the church whenever possible to do that, to find those forever homes for those kids. We also work in domestic infant adoption to find homes for newborns. And that's where we started, but it's interesting. It's about 8% of our work now. So that's what a lot of people know us for. But our world has changed, but we've continued to focus on serving vulnerable kids. And then we work with immigrants and refugees. So we still continue to do refugee resettlement, although it's much smaller than it had been in the past. Okay. Working with a lot of Congolese now. That program was put on a pause as by the United Nations as of two weeks ago, but it'll start up again at some point. So we resettle refugees. We work with unaccompanied refugee minors, and those are think of the Lost Boys of Sudan. We would help to find foster homes for those boys or girls. That'd be longer term foster care. That would be for years, typically. Yeah. And then we do the short-term work with the unaccompanied minors. So those are those unaccompanied minor kids that are coming across the border, and they usually stay with us for an average of 45 days in foster homes. And we're able to, again, to find a family member a family sponsor, and do the background check and all that in that 45-day period 97% of the time. So, and then the third area we're working is globally. So we do in-country adoption, in-country foster care, and also family preservation. Ethiopia is a great example. So we try to keep families together whenever possible.
Yeah.
So we do family preservation work. We help businesses and getting things going. People have income so they can keep their kids. We also then, for kids that don't have parents, or there's a lot of street kids in Ethiopia, we've been working with the church for about 10 years to get this program going. So in Ethiopia, this year alone, we did 125 adoptions, and those were with church partners. So we helped to set up the foster care and the adoption system in Ethiopia, because there wasn't even a word for foster care in Amharic before we started the program. So we are doing foster care, we are doing adoption with the church in Ethiopia, and that family preservation work. While at the same time, we are working with unaccompanied refugee minors that have fled from South Sudan in refugee camps. So that's just one example. We're working in many countries, but those are kind of our core services. Again, it's vulnerable in the U.S., immigrants and refugees, and our global services in country.
Wow. So, Chris, I want to give you the opportunity to maybe speak into our listeners, but before we close, about how they could and might I say how they should get involved. What would be sort of your call to action for believers to lean into these three areas that you've described are core to Bethany's mission?
Oh yeah, it's now is the time to step up. People of faith, Christians, followers of Christ, now is the time to not act out of fear. I think that the world is in a fearful place. This is a time for us to lead. So I would say get involved in the foster care system here in the U.S. Find out how you can help. Is there a way you can volunteer? Is there a way to provide basic needs for foster care parents? Get involved in the foster care system. Immigrants and refugees, they're there. The unaccompanied minors, think about kids. Take in a kid temporarily in the foster care system. Again, the average stay is for 45 days. Or globally, get involved. Find out who's doing what, working with refugees. We're in the midst of the biggest displacement crisis our world has ever seen. So, pray, sponsor a kid. There's so many ways that people can get involved. And I'd like to say, work with Bethany, but there's also other great organizations out there too that are doing just wonderful work. So find the one that fits best with you, but I want to encourage people to do something. Don't act out of fear. This is our time to lead, and the world needs to see that. The world needs to see Christians forefront leading.
Well, Chris, I follow you on Twitter at Chris Palusky, Palusky. I feel like you really use Twitter to put out, kind of grounded, factual statements about the crises that are being experienced around the world by these vulnerable children and these vulnerable families. You mentioned Bethany.org. Are there other places digitally online where people could sort of get connected or learn more or do more?
Absolutely. We're on Facebook, so look up Bethany Christian Services on Facebook. Check out us on Twitter. We have Bethany Twitter. It's Bethany Christian Services, and then, of course, myself, Chris Palusky, and then Bethany.org. We have a central website, and then we also have one per state that we're in, and it also breaks down our country work also. So there's different avenues, and please get involved.
Yeah, get involved. Well, Chris, on behalf of Dan and I and all of our listeners, we can't thank you enough for all of your time today and for just helping us understand these tough issues a little bit better. I feel like ignorance and political separation are sort of these things that prevent Christians from maybe doing more. And we should just heed your call to lean into the mess, to get involved, to do something. Let's all do something, all listeners in these areas that Chris has described. Every one of you, let's at least do one thing. and we'll find that the world is better off because of people who are followers and believers in Christ. So, Chris, we'll continue to pray for you, for your family, for Bethany, for the people that you serve. Thank you for really, and I know you avoid this from a humility perspective, but of all the people that I know that are leading organizations, you really do exemplify the Good Samaritan in all the ways that Jesus intended through that parable. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for today. To all of our listeners, this is Dan Riveros and David Henriksen on the Walking Through Samaria podcast with good friend and CEO of Bethany Christian Services, Chris Palusky. It has been a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.
See you guys soon. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.